All right, there we go. So let's start the sixth episode of the Auspicious Elections podcast, which is a private podcast that's available for patrons of the Astrology podcast each month. So this month we're going to be looking at the auspicious electional charts for June of 2017. So joining me is Lisa Scheim. Hi, Lisa.
Hi.
Welcome back. I can't believe we're already 6 episodes into this, so it's been going pretty well. This time, we're expanding our efforts a little bit to do both a video podcast and an audio podcast. So, for those of you who are following this, if you're watching the video version, you'll be able to track the charts as we're going through them. If you're doing the audio version, then you'll be able to just open up this post and you'll find the PDF charts for each of the charts that we're going to talk about. So there's something for everyone, whether you're more visual or more auditory in terms of tracking what we're doing with the elections each month. So let's get right into the auspicious elections for June. So what sort of things did you run into this month, Lisa, in terms of looking for auspicious electional charts over the next few weeks?
Well, one of the major changes is that Mars goes into Cancer after the first few days of June. And I hear an echo. I hear a major echo.
Yeah, I think it's going away. It was just for some reason it raised the volume really quickly on my side, but
Okay.
try it again.
Okay. So after the first few days of June, Mars goes into Cancer. And so up to this point, we had been doing a lot of Libra rising elections and Cancer rising elections, a lot of cardinal signs. And the cardinal signs, either for rising signs or moon signs, are not going to be as uniformly positive after the first few days of June. So that's a big change because it will make Mars angular, at least in a day chart. You don't want that. One of the positive sides of that, though, is that the mutable signs become more workable because you no longer have Mars and Saturn in mutable signs, you just have Saturn.
Just
So,
have Saturn. Okay.
yeah, so that's one of the big changes. Um, yeah, I'd say that's the biggest change. The other kind of general note is that mid-month, I'm not so crazy about the elections, so I ended up sticking to early and late June elections. So Neptune does station mid-month, and so I do use the outer planets not as rulers, but I still pay attention to them. And it's not only going to be stationing and thereby becoming a stronger kind of influence during the middle of the month, but Mercury is also very closely square Neptune at the same time. Yeah, so, and you're animating that right now.
Sure. So Mercury gets into mid Gemini and it's in its own sign, but it starts squaring Neptune at 14 degrees of Pisces.
Yeah, and around the same time, I was kind of going back and forth about that as far as whether those were deal breakers. The Sun is also very closely opposing Saturn right around the same time, mid-month. So, decided to steer clear of mid-month elections because of that.
Okay. So that's an issue towards the middle of the month. Mars goes into Cancer also at the very beginning of the month. And so that changes things so that the mutable signs are freed up a little bit more, but then you have a little bit more problem in the cardinal signs. And I know you said that that becomes an issue later on when Mars starts getting close to squaring Jupiter, right?
Yeah, at least insofar as if you wanted to use, say, like a Sag rising election, which is possible now since it's not highlighting both Mars and Saturn. Um, but then you have Jupiter ruling Sagittarius. And so with Mars overcoming Jupiter from an earlier sign from Cancer, when it gets closer, you don't really want to use that.
Okay, got it. Are there any more sort of like overall things that should be mentioned before we get into the specific elections?
No, I think that was pretty much it as far as the overview.
All right. So let's pull up our first chart then. What is the data for our first chart?
Um, let's see. So for the first chart of the month, it's June 3rd. I've set it for 3:16 p.m. here in Denver, which makes it approximately 13 Libra rising.
Okay, so people can set the chart for around a quarter after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, local time. So whatever your local, uh, you're setting it for 3:15, whatever your time is, and it should approximately result in about mid degrees of Libra rising. So what you're going to want to do is just adjust the chart so that in your location you have 13 Libra rising and Jupiter conjunct the degree of the ascendant.
Hmm.
Okay, so what is good about this chart?
Let's see. And do you have that chart? It looks like we've still visually got the Sag rising chart up.
Oh, okay. Let's see. So let's share the screen. So here's the chart for June 3rd, 2017 with 13 Libra rising.
Hmm. So, one of the reasons why I like this chart, of course, is because it's the very last day that you can use a Libra rising chart before Mars is up in Cancer there. Um, so you've got the Moon in Libra in the first house with Jupiter in a day chart. The Moon is first applying to trine the Sun in Gemini in the ninth house, and then goes on to conjoin Jupiter. So that's really nice. Where I've set it here, this exact time has Jupiter exactly on the ascendant degree. And then Venus is ruling the ascendant, and it's placed in the seventh house in Aries, and it's applying to sextile Mars with reception. So Venus is in Aries, and it is applying to its ruler Mars. So those are some of the things that I really like. It does make Jupiter and Venus both the benefics angular, while Mars and Saturn are kind of out of the way.
Yeah, that's definitely nice. So both Venus and Jupiter in angular houses and Mars and Saturn are in cadent houses.
Hmm.
Okay. And we've got a pretty tight Moon Jupiter conjunction there in the first house. The Sun and Moon are also trine, which is nice. This is a day chart, so Jupiter is fully benefic, and this is one of the reasons you went with this election. It looks like is that this is one of the last days before Mars moves into Cancer, at which point it will start beginning to square Jupiter by sign, and then eventually by degree later on in June.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly.
So this is also one of the last Libra rising charts, which we've been using for a while, that you can use before Mars moves into Cancer and thus moves into the 10th whole sign house. So that's also problematic because normally you would not want to put Mars in the 10th house in a day chart in most electional charts.
Right.
Okay. Let's see what else. And one of the sort of iffy things is that Venus, the ruler of the ascendant, is very closely conjunct Uranus, which can be kind of a destabilizing type signature, although at least it's separating at this point, and then it's applying to the sextile with Mars, and it also has somewhat stabilizing or grounding trine with Jupiter or with Saturn at 25 degrees of Sagittarius.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. I don't love the Venus Uranus conjunction, but as you said, it is separating, so that's good at least in the trine to Saturn. One thing I also forgot to note that I also like about this chart is that the Sun is pretty closely trine Jupiter. It is just slightly separating, though. It's not applying anymore. But since the Moon trines the Sun first and then goes on to conjoin Jupiter, it kind of brings that trine together still, even though it is separating technically.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, that's a good thing, especially for the sun as a general significator, but also with the sun ruling the 11th house, that could be helpful in this chart in terms of friends or alliances, and having some sort of beneficial or stabilizing influence from them, since it's a trine to the sun, the ruler of the 11th house from Jupiter.
Hmm. Yeah, and Jupiter is also pretty close to stationing direct. So it's about 5 or 6 days away from stationing direct. So it's a pretty nice Jupiter in the first house there.
Yeah, that's really important and powerful. And we actually talked about that, Austin and Kelly and I, on the forecast episode this month, just in terms of Jupiter stationing, especially stationing direct like that, if it's within 7 days, being a really powerful energizing factor for a planet, and especially for Jupiter in a day chart. If you're putting it right on the first, that's a really amped up or sort of juiced up Jupiter to be putting on the degree of the ascendant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is definitely one of my favorite charts of the month.
Okay, awesome. All right. Trying to think of anything else, but I think that covers it. I mean, this is not a chart that focuses a lot, even though the Sun and Mars are in Gemini. It's not a very Mercury focused chart, and Mercury is not very prominent in this chart. And either way, it's just sort of hanging out in no man's land in Taurus at 24 degrees, not really applying to anything and not really doing anything at this point.
Yeah, that's true.
So this is a better chart for sort of Venus type things, for the 10th house, since the ruler of the 10th is the moon applying to Jupiter, for the first house, which is very strong and very positive in terms of Jupiter being there conjunct the ascendant,
Mm-hmm.
but not otherwise a very mercurial type chart.
No, yeah, I would use it for maybe making good impressions. Good appearance type of impressions, identity things, career things for sure. With the moon, the ruler of the 10th house, with Jupiter in the first, and then possibly friends or groups.
Okay. And let's see, the last thing is that this is one of the last elections where we're using Libra rising and Venus in Aries, which I know that some traditional astrologers, especially like Renaissance astrologers, might not be big on, because Venus is in the sign of its detriment or the sign of its adversity or the sign of its exile or whatever you want to call it. But in this instance, you've got to weigh the accidental dignity of having both benefics angular in the first and the seventh, and having both malefics not as prominent by being cadent, with the essential dignity of Venus. And there's some mitigation in terms of the essential dignity issue, because Venus is applying to a sextile with Mars, its domicile lord, and therefore it has reception with Mars, and thus it's strengthening Venus's zodiacal placement, even though it's otherwise in a sign that it doesn't normally do well with. Venus is probably doing as good or the best as you possibly could, given that in Aries in this sort of setup.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And we have been using a lot of charts that featured Venus as the ascendant ruler. So, um, yeah, I mean, as we'll see as we go on with the rest of the month, Venus does move into Taurus after this, and it's better placed by sign, but it doesn't end up really applying to much. So it really is kind of a mixed bag as far as whether, these Venus and Aries ones were kind of better, even though they aren't, it isn't traditionally good by sign.
Sure. All right. All right. Well, I think that covers our first election for the month. So, what is the next electional chart, or the next electional chart that you could find after that?
So the next one's going to be June 8th. I set it for 11:56 a.m., which puts 7 Virgo rising.
June 8th at what time?
11:56 a.m.
Okay, I had it set for PM,
Yeah.
so AM. There we go. So 7 degrees of Virgo rising.
Mm-hmm. So, so as you can see, we can use the mutable rising signs again. So long as it is a day chart, you still want to make sure the mutable rising sign charts are day charts, since Saturn is still angular. So you don't want to make Saturn angular in a night chart. But so Virgo rising is definitely a day chart. So Mercury is placed in the 10th house in Gemini as the ascendant ruler. I've actually placed it right on the midheaven degree. And it's not very close by degree yet, but it's applying to a trine with Jupiter in the second house. And Jupiter is actually stationing direct, basically June 8th and 9th. It's stationing direct. So it is stationing at this point in this electional chart. And then the moon is in Sagittarius in the 4th house, and it's applying to a sextile with that same Jupiter, with reception, since Jupiter rules the moon. Yeah, so this is speaking of Mercury elections, this one's a much stronger Mercury election.
Yeah, this is a very strong Mercury election. So it's got Virgo rising, so that makes Mercury the ruler of the ascendant, which automatically puts the focus on Mercury. And then Mercury is both strong according to its essential dignity by being in Gemini, which is one of the signs that it rules. So Mercury is able to act in a way that's fully in accord with its basic nature in that sign, thus giving it a sort of strength, you might say, or power. So of strength in terms of Gemini and auspiciousness, but then Mercury is also conjunct the degree of the midheaven in the 10th house, both by whole sign houses and by quadrant houses. So it also has accidental dignity and essentially strength according to the quadrant framework. So it's a powerful planet. So, and then finally, it's also applying to a trine. It's a somewhat wide trine, but it's applying to a trine with that stationary Jupiter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Mercury's also loosely square the ascendant by, say, 3.5 degrees. So, I mean, it's kind of angular both ways, at least here. I was trying to get a Mercury Jupiter trine chart out of this month because it is applying for about half the month. But as we were talking about before, the mid month charts just get too muddled with Neptune and the Sun Saturn opposition. So this was, even though it wasn't very close in degree, this was the best I could do in terms of the Mercury Jupiter trine still applying.
Okay, that's pretty good. And Jupiter is super amped up still because now it's at the sort of day or two of its station. Mercury's in the 10th house, so it's a very much 10th house focused chart. So this would be a good chart for career, reputation, standing out, uh, business. It's a pretty good financial chart as well, with Jupiter in the second house in a day chart, stationing there and configured well to Mercury. Even the ruler of the second house is doing pretty well, which is Venus, which is now placed in Taurus in the ninth whole sign house. If you wanted to, you might even move the ascendant a little bit earlier to get the ascendant closely trine Venus, which will help it to be more active despite being in a cadent or a declining house. Uh, let's see, the moon's doing really well. There's an interesting interplay here in terms of the 11th house and the topic of friendship, because on the one hand, that's the part of the chart where we have the most difficulties because we have Mars in a day chart in Cancer in the 11th whole sign house. So this would not normally be a chart where you would want to do anything related to the 11th house because there's a potential for strife or conflict in that area of the chart. But on the other hand, this also is a classic example of a condition of bonification known as counteraction, because even though Mars is pretty poorly placed in the 11th house in this chart by being contrary to the sect and being in the sign of its fall or in the sign of its depression, Cancer, opposite to its exaltation, the ruler of the 11th house is actually the moon, and it's extremely well placed as a result of being in the fourth house in an angular house, pretty closely conjunct the degree of the IC, and applying to that sextile with Jupiter, with reception, and with Jupiter in a day chart in a superior position overcoming the moon. So the moon's actually in a condition pretty much of bonification at that point. It's got a little bit of challenge as a result of being in the same sign and being in a very wide application with Saturn. But because this is a day chart, Saturn is much more positive and much more constructive than it would be otherwise if it was a night chart. So that's not going to cause many problems. And the fact that the moon hits that sextile with Jupiter first before it goes to Saturn, um, pretty much erases or gets rid of a large part of any problem that we might otherwise have with putting the moon in the same sign as Saturn.
Right. Yeah, I agree with all that. And I really liked that there was that counteraction because otherwise you could just say that Mars, that is no good for friends at all. And that, sometimes you need to do things that involve friends, even if that's not the main topic, or involve, associates, even if it's not the main topic, especially if you're doing something, an election for career, which this would be. So it's really nice that there is something offsetting that Mars in case you do need to involve other associates. The other thing that's super nice about this chart being good for both the 10th house and the second house is that's not always the case. And usually, when you do an election for something like career, it necessarily involves money, even if that's kind of not your main objective in doing it. So, and oftentimes you can't get both houses well placed. So it's really nice that this has both financial and career positive indications.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the things about counteraction, one of the ways that it often works out is that the placement of the initial planet indicates the first part of the matter or how things go initially, but then the condition of the ruler indicates the way that things go later on and in terms of the outcome. So this would be a situation where there might be difficulties or strife or conflict with friends or separation with friends initially due to Mars in the 11th house. But then because the ruler is so well placed and is being bonified by Jupiter, there would be a reversal in terms of things getting better and eventually becoming stabilized and reconciled after that initial period of difficulty. So that's a pretty positive sort of instance of counteraction. Whereas sometimes we see it the opposite way, where things start out well, but then they fall apart later. This would be the opposite scenario.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any other, let's see, are there any other main points about this chart besides those?
Um, I mean, the only other thing I would maybe say is that Neptune is a little bit angular, um, and maybe 7 degrees off the descendant. And so, I just had an eye out for that, of course, going towards the rest of the month. So even though Mercury does hit Jupiter first, it's configured to both Jupiter and Neptune. So it's just something to think about, especially as far as other people you might be dealing with. So if you're dealing with one other person in a situation with the seventh house signifying like one-on-one encounters, that might be something to just kind of keep an eye out for, as far as clear communication and making sure that you're seeing everything clearly on the other end.
Sure. Yeah, and that's really one of the only issues with Mercury is that it's going to start applying to and it's in the process of moving towards that square with Neptune. And while it's not super prominent yet, it will become more prominent before too long. So there is some broad sort of Mercury Neptune type situation going on here, which is a little bit contrasting with Mercury's otherwise pretty straightforward placement being in Gemini in the 10th house, and typically that being a good situation for communication. But I think because Neptune's square there, on the one hand, there could be potential for miscommunication with partners or with business relationships. But because Mercury is the ruler of the ascendant, sometimes that might be something that the person could harness in a positive sense if clearness in communication or if some sense of using Neptune to create a sort of illusion or a more positive perception of what's being communicated is necessary. That actually you might be able to use that to your own benefit in the selectional chart rather than as something that would be detracting from what you're trying to do necessarily.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, especially as it hits Jupiter and Neptune pretty close in time. It can be like very pleasant communication from both of those sides.
Sure. Okay, that sounds pretty good. And yeah, I think that just about does it for this chart. So, what was the main chart that we highlighted for this month again? I forget.
That was June 3rd.
Okay, so the very first chart that we highlighted with the Libra rising, that was the chart for the month.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so that was the most auspicious electional chart. This one's pretty close, though, in terms
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
a runner up. I would say this is just as good, if not better, in some ways than the previous chart, but they both have their sort of pros and cons depending on what your focus is.
Yeah, exactly. And whether you want more of a Venus chart, a Venus election versus a Mercury election, really, they're both positive. And the only maybe possible reason, besides not putting Jupiter in the first as a general positive thing, that I would downgrade this one a little bit for is just that the next moon application is just a sextile. And that's not typically, like the strongest positive application you could have.
Sure. Yeah, versus the conjunction with Jupiter that the June 3rd chart has.
Yeah, it has the trine to the sun and then the conjunction to Jupiter, both of which are, usually considered stronger than a sextile.
Sure. Although the reception with Jupiter does
Yes.
even strengthen the nature of that sextile aspect quite a bit.
Yeah, for sure. So
Okay.
they're both
So
good.
definitely. All right. So it looks like there's a long gap then after June 8th before you could find another good electional chart. And it looks like the next election takes place on June 20th.
hmm
What was the reason for the long gap?
So that was the aforementioned Mercury Neptune square that happens mid month while Neptune is stationing, which I just think is a bit much. But I mean, I was trying to look at charts to consider whether there was something else that would outweigh that, or whether you would, make something else the ruler of the ascendant. But at the same time, the Sun is closely opposing Saturn mid month, so all of that's happening at the same time. So they're not things that are insurmountable as a transit. But I just wasn't sure about cementing all of that in the election of, the inception of something that's going to go on for a long time.
Okay, got it. Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, it's kind of tricky. Mercury Neptune is one of those combinations that's very clear and very stark sometimes in terms of the difficulties in communication or miscommunication or sometimes deception that comes along with it. So sometimes it is, especially if you're shooting for a Mercury election or you're shooting for clarity, it can be important to avoid things like that unless there's something very specific that you have an election for that would be good for or useful for in some way.
Yeah, and I was almost trying to go with one of those and say, well, maybe you could use this for, a creative or romantic, that kind of thing, or just for pleasure. But it ended up being at 5 in the morning anyway, and so, you know, just not that practical. And then the Sun Saturn, honestly, um, that's going to feel pretty different than a Jupiter thing. So ultimately, just found some later in the month.
Sure. Okay. All right. So this chart is set for June 20th, 2017 at 2:56 in the morning.
hmm
Okay.
Yeah, it is.
So
It
got to
is.
get up pretty early
Yeah,
that day.
some of the good charts are in the middle of the night for June. So this one is Taurus rising, and so Venus is now in its own sign of Taurus. So that's really nice. And Venus is the benefic of the sect for night charts, so it's the better of the two benefics to highlight at the night in the nighttime. So that's right in the first house. Then the moon is exalted in Taurus as well in this chart, and that's also in the first house. So that's really nice. The moon is applying to a sextile with Mars in the third house with reception. And let's see what else. The Sun and Mercury are still opposing Saturn, but they're both separating. So that's definitely better. Let's see. The other thing you could do with this chart, we had some discussions about, the dignity issue of doing Aries rising, because if you do Aries rising with the same chart, you do put Mars in Cancer as the ascendant ruler, which isn't great by dignity, but it's applying to Jupiter. The thing that happens if you do make that an Aries rising chart rather than a Taurus rising chart is you make the second house really nice. You put an exalted moon and Venus ruling the second house in Taurus. So that's kind of
Right.
nice. That's a variation you could do.
Whereas for this chart, the second house isn't doing that well, even though Mercury's there in its own domicile. That opposition from Saturn in a night chart is pretty problematic and pretty debilitating, even though it's separating.
Yeah.
It's not a great chart for financial matters, but it's a really amazing Venus election with Taurus rising, Venus right on the ascendant in a night chart. So you really almost can't get a better Venus than this. The only better thing that you could do is if Jupiter was there in Taurus with Venus, or you had a nice trine or sextile or something from Jupiter. But that's not possible at the moment, of course, since Jupiter's in Libra. completely not aspected to Venus.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely a nice Venus election. Yeah. So, yeah, that was just the variation I was thinking of. If you, because this chart wasn't good for financial things. So, if you needed to do an election for financial matters at this time, you could just switch up the rising, the election time slightly and switch the rising sign.
Okay, got it. All right. Well, yeah, that's a pretty good chart, especially for a Venus election. And I know, I mean, Venus elections are, things for art or artistic matters or beautifying things, things that seek to reconcile or bring things together in a broad sort of archetypal sense, like reconciliations with friends or other things like that. I'm trying to think of other good Venus things that you could use this for.
Mm-hmm. Um, yeah. I mean, it's also ruling the sixth and in the first, so even possibly health related things.
Sure, health or bodily matters with Jupiter also there in the sixth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it would be a pretty good chart for that, for first house related sort of physical matters.
Right.
Okay, so like even like beginning a diet or exercise routine to some extent might be useful for something like this.
Yeah, I agree. Though I'm just smiling because it's like 3 a.m. So I'm just imagining the neighbor's reaction if you start exercising, at 3 a.m.
Right, right. Well, people have been, I think somebody in an interview last month that I did with the Astrological Association Journal, they asked me about my electional chart for the book, which I mentioned in the acknowledgments or in the introduction. And I looked at it again and it's set for like 4 or 5 in the morning. So I know I got up super early that morning to catch what was, I think, a Virgo rising election with Mercury in Virgo in like September or something like that, really early in the morning. So sometimes, that's what you've got to do to get the best electional charts. And even if you just start or initiate the project at that point, sometimes that's sufficient symbolically that you kind of got it going at that point, and then maybe go back to bed for a few hours and pick it up later.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's something that I often speak to electional clients about is that you don't need to do everything all out at that moment in time, especially if it's like a small window or that sort of thing, small time window. You just need to do the first thing that symbolically starts the matter. And that's usually enough.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. So let's see. So, and then the next electional chart. So that's also like actually a really good electional chart. Um, yeah, I don't think I can see anything else that's worth mentioning about that.
It could be good for communication type things as well because it does highlight a bit the third house because the ruler of the third is in exaltation in the first and applying to Mars in the third. So
Right.
that's one other thing we didn't mention.
Yeah, possibly. Although, the Mercury Saturn opposition is still a little challenging just as a general
Right.
significator for that. So it's kind of a mixed bag.
That's true.
The other thing is that the midheaven in this one, if you put Venus right on the ascendant at 14 degrees of Taurus, then the degree of the MC, at least in Denver, and this will vary in other locations depending on where you are in the world, but at least here, the degree of the MC is at 25 Capricorn, which is pretty closely square to Uranus at 27 degrees of Aries. So that has the potential where it could create some instability in terms of career or reputation or matters pertaining to the public. And if that's something that's problematic in terms of what you're trying to initiate, one way that you could mitigate that or downplay that a little bit is by moving the time of the election a little bit earlier. So prior to 2:56 in the morning, maybe even move the ascendant back all the way to, let's say, 6 degrees of Taurus where the moon is, or somewhere in early Taurus. That would move the MC back away from Uranus a little bit, while keeping Venus in the first house, which would probably be fine and probably be acceptable. Of course, the only drawback then is that you'll end up probably putting Pluto closer to the degree of the midheaven, which itself is a little bit problematic. But I guess it's just a matter of sort of picking your poison there between Uranus and Pluto, which is the issue that we've had for most of the past decade, as those two planets have been pretty closely square.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I was playing with the midheaven, and it does put Pluto on the midheaven if you do back it up. But it's Uranus square the midheaven is not the most ideal, but then you get Venus right on the ascendant, so it's a little bit of a toss up.
Right. Okay. All right. So that's pretty good for June 20th. And then the next few elections take place pretty quickly over the span of the next week. What is the fourth? So we have two other possible charts, but what's the fourth election that you really want to highlight?
The fourth, let's see. So that's
Is it
going.
the June 27th chart?
Yeah, let's go with the June 27th chart. So that's going to be 2:51 a.m.
So June 27th, 2:51 a.m. with
Mm-hmm.
about 21 degrees of Taurus rising, conjunct the degree of Venus at 21 degrees Taurus as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And this is kind of a simple but positive election. So Venus, again, in a night chart, is the benefic of the sect, and it's right on the ascendant degree. The moon is around 2021 Leo in the fourth house, so it's angular. Um, and it's applying to very closely to a square with that Venus. And one additional thing that's really nice about this moon is that it's enclosed by the benefics. So it is separating from a sextile with Jupiter and then applying to a square with Venus. And so that's a really positive attribute for a moon to be in between aspects with the benefics. So that's one of the major things that's really good about this chart. Then I guess additionally, you do have several planets in Cancer, the Sun, Mercury, and Mars, all configured to both Jupiter and Venus by sign. Mercury is getting pretty close in degree as well. But the main thing was that, Venus, again, as the benefic of the sect, was on the ascendant again. So you get it angular, and you also have the moon in between the benefics. So those were the main attributes for this chart.
Yeah, that's really good. So the moon is enclosed, or in the medieval tradition, they referred to that as besiegement between the two benefics, which is a highly auspicious placement. And this is actually a better third house chart. Even though Mars is there in Cancer in the third, it's a night chart. So Mars is going to be much more constructive or much more positive than it otherwise might be. You've also got the moon there, or you've got Mercury there and the sun there. And then finally, the ruler is the moon, which is it's actually exchanging signs with the sun because the sun is in Cancer and the moon is in Leo. So it's a kind of loose mutual reception, or what's referred to as generosity in the medieval tradition. Yeah, that enclosure more than anything else is really excellent, especially because the moon's moving away from Jupiter, which is the less positive planet in this night chart, and it's applying towards the most positive planet in the chart, which is Venus, which is in a night chart much more benefic.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And again, this is another Venus election with Venus right on the ascendant. It's a little bit better in terms of the third house because we don't have and communication and things like that, because we don't have the opposition between Mercury and Saturn, which I think would free up communication a lot more. Mercury is applying to conjunction with Mars, which is not ideal, but I'm not that worried about it because, again, it's a night chart. So there's the potential for some assertiveness or some combativeness in communication or things sort of archetypally along those lines, but it's probably going to be more constructive than it might be if it was a day chart.
Yeah, definitely. And, Jupiter is also in the mix at an earlier degree than Mars. So, it's not going to be a purely Mercury Mars thing, even though that's also positive, more positive
Okay,
in
so
night chart.
Jupiter's actually intercepting the
Yeah.
applying conjunction between Mercury and Mars. So Mercury is not applying directly to Mars, but instead it hits Jupiter first, which is known as interception.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Any other major things about this chart that should be mentioned?
Let's see. Mm,
I mean, Saturn's in the eighth, so that this would not
yeah,
be a good chart for eighth house matters.
that's what I was about
Sort
to
of,
say. Yeah. Yeah, shared finances or even financial matters in general might not be great with Saturn across the financial axis.
okay. So eighth house, inheritance, shared finances. It's a little mixed for financial matters in general. Mercury's the ruler of the second. It's in Cancer. It's applying to Jupiter, which is pretty good, but it's not, it doesn't particularly stand out as being like an amazing financial chart necessarily. But instead, it's just really good primarily for the first house with Venus there, to some extent, the sixth house with Jupiter there. And then the third house has that sort of interesting thing going on because the ruler of the third is being bona fide. The moon is being bona fide by Venus and Jupiter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right, that's pretty good. All right, so those are our four highlighted charts for this month in terms of the four auspicious elections that we try to shoot for each month. And you found one other chart, I think, that you considered but sort of ruled out as not one of the top four, right?
Yeah, there was one a few days before this on June 24th that, maybe not, isn't quite as good. You could certainly use it if you needed to use something that day or, those couple days around there. It was 1:21 a.m. here in Denver, and that made 13 degrees of Aries rising. And let's see. So, yeah, this was one where Mars in Cancer was ruling the ascendant. It's in the fourth house. So, by dignity, Mars in Cancer is not great. However, it is very closely applying to square Jupiter. Jupiter is not the benefic of the sect because it's a night chart rather than a day chart. So Jupiter isn't as positive as it might otherwise be during the day, but it's still a benefic. So you've got the ascendant ruler applying to a benefic very closely. And then you've got 4 planets in Cancer there. So Sun, Moon, it's just after the new moon in Cancer. So Sun, Moon, Mercury, and Mars all in Cancer. So they're all by sign square to that Jupiter. And then they're also sextile to Venus in Taurus. Venus is at 18 Taurus in this chart. So it's the ascendant ruler, you'd have questions about the dignity of the ascendant ruler, but otherwise there's some other nice things going on. So if you needed to do something around this time before the 27th, this is also a pretty decent chart.
Yeah, so the basic issue is that even though Mars does not function its best in Cancer in terms of in a way that's natural to its significations or in a way that's conducive to its most not convenient, but its most constructive functioning in Cancer because it's the sign of its depression or the sign of its fall. It's otherwise extremely well placed in an angular house. It is a night chart, which makes Mars much more constructive. It's applying to very closely to one benefic, Jupiter, which is angular in the seventh. It's in aversion to Saturn, so it's not harmed or held back in any way by Saturn. And it also has that applying sextile with Venus, which is in a superior position in Taurus, which consequently makes this actually a pretty good second house election as well. And then we've got a new moon where the new moon just took place at 2 degrees of Cancer. So the moon is actually waxing at this point at the very start of the new moon with the moon in its own domicile.
Yeah, so it's a decent fourth house election, because it's got the ruler of its own sign right there in the fourth house as well. So I don't know. I'm almost tempted to test this out for something and see how that goes using this election.
Sure, testing. It's almost just a test of like essential dignity in terms of being placement by sign versus accidental dignity and like all of the other dignities going really well and seeing what, how that works out and what the major difference is in terms of the success or failure of the election.
Right. Yeah. And it's a good thing to do, if you're trying to get really good at casting your own elections, is just testing ones that are sort of good, but maybe not as good as like the best one for the month, and just kind of seeing the results, because you don't really know otherwise if you're just doing it in theory. So it's actually kind of a good idea to test some kind of mediocre elections.
Yeah, it's something I think we talked about, Austin and Kelly and I did, where there's some of those rules that you definitely want to test, and everybody goes through that process, and it's important to. But then it's like sometimes there's certain rules where, they're just like across the board, always recommended against in a lot of the traditional electional texts. And sometimes astrologers go through that phase, sort of rebellious phase of like, damn the text, I'm going to try out this election because I need to start something right now, and then just totally having terrible problems or setbacks or sort of catastrophes in an electional chart that would be not considered good traditionally due to some signature, and sort of learning from that experience, like, okay, there's something to that rule. So I'm not sure that this is necessarily one of those, because this is definitely not worst case scenario. Having a major significator in a difficult zodiacal placement is not always a complete deal breaker, but it is one of those things that's worth experimenting with in order to see what that's actually like and what the difference is versus, one of those other charts where we had Venus in its own sign ruling the ascendant, or Mercury in its own sign ruling the ascendant, versus something like this where you have Mars in Cancer ruling the ascendant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, as always, if anyone chooses to test it out, let us know how that thing went, whatever you started then.
All right. Well, I think that then brings us about to the end of this episode. So we've shared 4 charts, 4 auspicious electional charts, plus 1 test chart that people could test out, and that might be just as useful, but a little bit less auspicious than the other 4. So we didn't want to make that one of the top 4 for the month. So, yeah, I think that brings us to the end of our auspicious elections episode for this month. Thanks everyone for joining us. So this is a bonus that we release each month towards the end of the month for patrons of the Astrology podcast who donate on the $5 or $10 tiers. So thanks a lot if you're one of those patrons who's watching this for donating and for helping to support the podcast and helping to support our work. I hope that you find these auspicious electional charts useful, and we always appreciate feedback and comments and just learning and hearing about how different people are using these elections in practice and what the outcome was.
Yeah, so definitely write in and let us know what you're doing with these elections. And thank you for listening, as always.
Yeah, and for those of you, I think I'm going to use this at some point as like a promotional thing, maybe once June is over. So if you'd like to subscribe to these episodes, or you liked what we're doing here and you'd like to get the next episode before it's time to use some of these electional charts, then you can find out more information on the Astrology Podcast page on Patreon, which you can access through our website at theastrologypodcast.com/subscribe, or going to Patreon and looking up the Astrology Podcast. So before we wrap up, any other things? So what's your website again, Lisa?
It's lisasheim.com, and I do elections and consultations there.
Okay, and you're currently seeing electional clients. I'm not at the moment. I'm just doing these electional episodes, but I do teach an online course on electional astrology, which you can find out more information about at chrisbrennanastrologer.com. All right, I think that brings us to the end of this episode then. So thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, as always.
All right, and thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.